Every other building we have talked about, Notre Dame, the Florence Dome, the Hagia Sophia, Saint Cathedral, men who studied what came before, refined what existed, pushed an established system to its limit.
Saint Basil's Cathedral was built by two men, possibly just one,
who appear in the historical record almost without precedent, without documented training in the traditions they would need to draw on, producing a building that combines Russian tent architecture, Byzantine domes, Italian Renaissance detailing, and structural innovations that have no clear source in any single prior tradition. And they built it in 5 years. There is one structural fact about this iconic cathedral that stops engineers cold when they first encounter it. 8 separate masonry towers, each carrying a dome of different weight, each built on foundations of different depth, all connected to a central structure, and the entire complex has not developed a single significant structural crack in 460 years. Not because the ground is stable. It is not. Red Square sits on the Moscow River floodplain. The soil shifts seasonally with the freeze and thaw cycle. Every building on that square has required ongoing maintenance and repair. Saint Basil's has not. We get to why. But first, the moment it was born. The Grand Capital, 1552. The formidable sovereign, the ruler history would remember with awe, has just achieved something that Russians had been trying to do for generations. He has conquered Kazan.
That Tatar stronghold on the Volga that had been raiding Russian lands for over a century.
The victory is so significant, so unexpected in its completeness, that Ivan decides it requires a monument unlike anything Russia has built before. Not a monastery, not a fortress, a cathedral, a building that will stand in the center of the Grand Capital, visible from the Kremlin walls, announcing to every person who enters the city that God favors the Tsar of Russia. Even commissions 2 architects, their names recorded in a 17th century chronicle, are Postnik Yakovlev and Barma. Some historians believe they may be the same person. Postnik, sometimes called Barma as a nickname, a single master builder of extraordinary skill whose identity has blurred across the centuries. What we know is what they built. The commission is specific and, from an architectural standpoint, nearly impossible. We can make it work, Your Majesty. Find a way. Ivan wants 8 chapels, each dedicated to a saint on whose feast day a battle in the Kazan campaign was won. Arranged around a central 9th church dedicated to the intercession of the Virgin. Each chapel must be distinct. Each must be recognizable as its own structure, and all of them must read, from any approach, as a single unified building. Think about what that requires structurally. 8 separate towers, each with its own load path, its own foundation, its own dome, of different sizes, different heights, different weights, built so close together that their foundations and walls are physically touching in some places. When 2 masonry structures sit adjacent to each other on shared soil, they influence each other's settlement. If the differential settlement between adjacent towers is uneven, the walls that connect them develop stress fractures. The connections between the towers become zones of failure. This is the problem that should have made this architectural marvel structurally impossible. It did not. Here is the detail that engineers find most surprising when they study the building's foundations. Postnik Yakovlev, or whoever actually designed this, built each tower on a foundation system that is subtly different from its neighbors. Not radically different, subtly. The depth varies, the footprint varies. The thickness of the foundation walls varies in ways that correspond with a precision that is difficult to attribute to chance. To the weight of the structure above each one. Heavier domes sit on deeper, wider foundations. Lighter domes sit on shallower foundations sized to match. The differential settlement between adjacent towers. The uneven sinking that should have cracked every connection wall is minimized because the foundations were designed to settle at approximately the same rate. This is not something that could have been calculated in 1555. The mathematical framework for predicting soil settlement under load would not be developed for another 300 years. But it is what the building shows. Either the architect had a physical intuition about soil behavior under masonry load that went far beyond anything documented in Russian or European building practice of the time,
and adjusting subsequent sections accordingly while construction proceeded.
The second explanation is the one most engineers find more credible, and it implies something remarkable. The architect was reading the ground as he built, watching the soil respond to each new load, adjusting the next foundation before pouring it, based on what the previous foundation was doing, building and correcting simultaneously. In the same way, the builders of Notre Dame corrected the flying buttresses. Not perfection, observation, correction, continuation. Now, the domes. Because no prior example existed. The tent-shaped roofs of traditional Russian wooden architecture, the form most people of the region would have associated with a sanctuary, are structurally straightforward when built in timber. Wood is flexible, relatively light, and easy to work. Translating that tent shape into masonry is a different problem entirely, that a simple hemispherical dome does not. The facets of the tent act like a series of triangular vaults, each one pushing outward along its base and downward along its edges. The walls below must resist thrust in multiple directions simultaneously. Postnik-Yakovlev's solution was to build each tent-roofed tower as an essentially self-contained structural unit, with walls thick enough at the base to absorb its own thrust without requiring external buttressing. Each tower stands on its own. The connections between towers carry relatively little structural load. They are mostly enclosing walls, corridors, passages, rather than load-bearing elements. This independence is the key to why the building works. Small as Yakovlev had made them through careful foundation design, causes no cascading failures. Each tower settles slightly differently, and because they are not structurally dependent on each other, those slight differences do not propagate into cracks. The building looks like 8 structures fused together. Structurally, it behaves like 8 structures standing close together, but not fully joined. The visual unity and the structural independence are simultaneous. Now, the building itself. The city in 1555 smells like pine smoke and river mud, and the particular cold that rolls off the northern plains in October.
The city is still largely built of wood. Stone construction in Russia in the 16th century is rare.
Reserved for the most significant buildings, the workers on the Saint Basil site are working in a tradition that has very little stone construction behind it. There is no guild system comparable to Western Europe's. There is no inherited body of masonry knowledge built across centuries of cathedral construction. Builders in 1555 had been building primarily in wood for generations. What Postnik Yakovlev, if he was from this Byzantine dome construction, inherited through the Orthodox tradition of church building. Italian Renaissance technical knowledge, brought to Moscow by Italian architects who had been working in the Kremlin for decades before Saint Basil's was commissioned. And the deep knowledge of Russian wooden architecture, the tent roofs, the clustered towers, the visual complexity of stacked forms. That had no equivalent in either Byzantine or Western European practice. He synthesized all three into something that belonged to none of them. There is a detail about the construction timeline that deserves to stand alone for a moment. Saint Basil's Cathedral was built in approximately 5 years, from 1555 to 1561. The great medieval cathedral took nearly 2 centuries. The famous octagonal dome took 16 years, just for the dome itself. after 100 years of preparation. A comparable grand structure took 600 years, 5 years for 8 domes. The workforce must have been enormous. The organization of the site, managing the delivery of stone and brick across a city.
Still primarily built of wood, coordinating the construction of 8 structurally independent towers simultaneously.
Maintaining the supply of lime and mortar through Moscow winters would have required logistical capacity of a high order. None of the administrative records of this construction have survived. We have the building. We do not have the paperwork. Think about what that means. Everything we know about how Saint Basil's was built, we know from the building itself. From the foundation depths, from the thickness of the walls, from the way the mortar behaves under modern testing, from the structural geometry that reveals, to an engineer willing to measure carefully, the decisions that were made, and the problems that were corrected along the way. The building is its own archive. There is one more detail that belongs in this story. The legend, almost certainly untrue, but too persistent to ignore entirely, holds that Ivan the Terrible had the architects blinded after the cathedral was completed, so they could never build anything as beautiful for anyone else. There is no historical evidence this happened. Postnik Yakovlev appears in records after 1561, alive and working on other buildings. Brought to Moscow by Italian architects who had been working in the Kremlin for decades before Saint Basil's was commissioned. That its creators were supposedly incapacitated to prevent them from surpassing it. That is not a historical fact. It is a measure of wonder. Step inside Saint Basil's Cathedral. The interior surprises almost everyone. The building that from outside seems enormous, the domes reaching skyward. The towers clustered together over a vast footprint is intimate within. The chapels are small. The ceilings are low in the corridors connecting them. The painted walls come close. You move through the building rather than standing in it, passing from chapel to chapel through passages that feel more like a labyrinth than a nave. The building was designed to be experienced in procession.
Moving, not stationary. Each chapel reveals itself only when you enter it.
And none of them prepares you for the next. This is not a failure of scale. It is a deliberate architectural choice. Outside, it overwhelms. Inside, it encloses. Both things at once. The men who built this grand cathedral, whoever they were, however many of them there were, whatever tradition they drew from, using a structural strategy that would not be mathematically explained for 3 centuries. They did not have a template. They did not have a tradition to follow. They had a commission from a czar who wanted something that had never existed. A deadline that would not move, and whatever they carried in their hands and minds from every building they had ever seen, or studied or helped construct. They built it anyway. The domes are still there, still distinct, still impossible looking against the Moscow sky. The same spiraling colors that were repainted after a fire in the 18th century, over the original surfaces, which were themselves over the original brick and plaster of 1561. Layer on layer, generation on generation, the same building, the same foundations, the same structural independence of 8 towers. That should have cracked and have not. They built it for a future they would never see. And across 4.5 centuries of Russian history, czars, revolutions, Soviet atheism, it is still there.